Just to frame a little bit, some of you may know in great detail quite a bit about education in the developing world, but it may also be a new topic for some of you. I'm told we have a very diverse audience here, which is wonderful. So I wanted to, in very basic terms, give you the story of global education, told from myself, who is, of course, a policy analyst sitting with a bird's eye view in Washington, D.C., and very engaged in the global arena. It would be a very different story, I'm sure, if I was a teacher working in Africa or the Minister of Education in Asia, etc. So the big picture really is quite a positive one. I would say in the last several decades, there has been a massive shift from education really being something that is only for the elite to something that is for the masses. It is something that students and youth groups and women's groups and parents and teachers and community leaders and governments are expected to deliver on for people all over the world. I can't imagine a leader today standing up and saying, actually, you know, we only are going to provide education for sort of the elite few future leaders of this country, which in many ways during the colonial era in many parts of the world, that was what happened. So it is a massive shift, it is a positive story, and it is really actually quite transformative. And schooling has become a very powerful symbol in many countries, or I would say probably globally, virtually in every country around the world. A powerful symbol of modernization, a powerful symbol of opportunity, a powerful symbol of how you move up in the economic ladder, as well as a chance for a better future from generation to generation. And you know, just a side note, schooling is not the same as education, and I would be interested to hear from the panelists. This is a heads up to all of you guys. Perhaps in the Q&A, you know, if some of the new innovations that we need to look forward to in global education is really breaking the sort of traditional four walls and a teacher in the front of a school, front of a classroom of the traditional vision of schooling. But I will bracket that. In terms of the trajectory of education within sort of global policy, in 1990, there was a big old meeting. Lots of ministers of education, all the international organizations from around the world got together and created the Education for All goals. These were a very broad set of goals that sort of articulated a shared vision of what quality education for everybody would look like, from adult education to youth to schooling for young people, etc. Those goals still have a lot of currency within the halls of ministers of education around the developing world. However, in 2000, 2 of those Education for All goals got plucked up and put into the Millennium Development Goals. And those are access to primary school for girls and boys equally. That is sort of the message that has been drummed over and over from the global community about what the focus should be on education policies in developing countries. Get your kids, your boys and your girls equally, into primary school. And actually there's been huge success. This, you know, certainly by no means everything that ministers of education have done solely, but it has been a massive priority for lots of governments, developing country governments, low-income, middle-income country governments around the world, and lots of more of kids have gotten into school, primary school, in the last 12 years. The problem is that in many ways this was the wrong goal. This was the wrong measure. Because although it's, you know, it's good to get into school, that is not the point and purpose of school. The point of getting an education is to learn something valuable, is to develop your skills and capacities, is to create human capital in a country. We heard a lot about that this morning, actually, from the panelists. And lo and behold, a sharp focus on access and enrollment into primary school has meant that there has been much less of a focus, although there can, you know, in many organizations in different parts of the world that quality of education is worked on, but there's been less of a focus on the quality of education, what kids are learning once they get there. And I would say there's really three massive challenges. As we stand here now, we have a couple more years until the Education for All and the Millennium Development Goals expire. And there's three main challenges that globally education is faced with. One is ensuring quality once you get into school. Two is ensuring equity, because by saying let's get all kids into school, but it's easier to focus on those who will quickly enroll and ignore those who need much more specific interventions to get them to the door of the school. Poor rural girls being at the bottom of the barrel, kids living in conflict-affected countries also being excluded, kids with disabilities, it goes on and on. So getting those most marginalized kids into the doors of education is going to be a massive challenge as well. And thirdly, I would say we need to really focus on expanding and bookending primary education. We need to think really carefully about early childhood, and we absolutely need to think about post-primary options, as a number of countries are grappling with very large cohorts of kids who are coming out now, having graduated primary school and don't have very many secondary school options. So there is, Beth, are you going to be giving some of the learning data, the learning crisis data? A little bit. So just to give a tiny, small snippet, there is, I would say, a large emerging consensus on the need to sort of shift and align our major focus from access only to access plus learning. And our next speaker will give a very detailed description of why that is, and what the World Bank is doing for that. But just to give you one or two snippets of why this is really important. Kids are having a really hard time around the world mastering even basic literacy and numeracy skills. And if you don't learn to read in the first couple years of school, it is very hard to be successful in your educational career, because of course it is a foundational skill which you need to go on and learn on other subjects. And there are some estimates, this comes from the Global Partnership for Education, this estimate, that of the 600 million kids enrolled in primary school around the world, 200 million of them are struggling heavily to master basic literacy skills. So they're really not learning how to read. This is a massive, massive concern. In terms of some of the things we're doing at Brookings at the Center for Universal Education, which I run. Last year we had, and I only brought one copy, I'm not sure why, but that's what made it into my bag on the way up. We did a report called the Global Compact on Learning, which is here and up for grabs for anyone who would like it afterwards, which basically articulated sort of a new vision for what could be a common policy agenda that is broader than the Millennium Development Goals and sort of reaches back to the Education for all goals, but not quite as broad. And a number of the recommendations that we made last year are getting played out. Specifically, one of them, which I would invite all of you to engage in if you're interested, is thinking about measuring learning. Because after all, and I've had these conversations with colleagues at the United Nations who are currently rethinking what the next Millennium Development Goals will be. They expire in 2015, so everyone actually is starting to cook up what could possibly be the next version of the Global Development Agenda. And if, after all, we are serious as an education community to say we want to align under Learning for All or Access Plus Learning, and say the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, we heard from him this morning, said, okay, great, we could have a global learning goal. Then the question I've been asked is, well, what is your baseline? And we do not have baseline data. We do not have an answer as an education community for learning. Enrollment is pretty clear and pretty easy to collect around the world. Learning is not. And we can get more into the weeds on that later. But there is a new task force being set up called the Learning Metrics Task Force within the UN, and Brookings is running the show with the UNESCO Institute of Statistics. That is really seeking to have a sort of global dialogue and consensus building within the education community on this question. and there'll be lots of opportunity for your input. So with that, I would just say that it is actually, from a global perspective, a very big moment for the education community. We have the Education for All goals are beginning to be revisited. The Millennium Development Goals are being revisited. We also are going to have a very large initiative coming out of the Secretary General's office in September on education. So it's an important moment for the community. And with that, I think I'll stop and look forward to hearing from all our speakers in more depth about the range of sort of strategies and directions and programmatic interventions that we may need to move this field forward. So, Beth, you're up.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to sound congested because I forgot to take my antihistamine. So I hope you don't mind. Okay, Rebecca already set the stage for a lot of what I'm going to say, actually. So I'm going to go immediately into the matters related to the education sector strategy or education strategy of the World Bank, which was launched last year. First, these are just kind of overviews for data for some of the things that Rebecca has already talked about. More than 2/3 of countries are not likely to meet in Africa. More than 2/3 of countries furthest from reaching the education SDGs are in Africa, and about 60 countries are actually not likely to meet the education SDGs as measured by primary completion rates. So you can see the light-colored countries are the ones that are off track to meet the SDGs. And then, with respect to the labor force, the workforce across countries, you see this huge difference between Niger on the one side and that's Kyrgyzstan on the other side. And the green bars, I don't expect you to read which countries these are, but the green bars are Africa. So you see that many of the African countries are actually on the side of where the percent of adults ages 24 to 44 with more than 10 years of schooling is. So you see this large variation across the developing world with respect to the proportion of the populations in the prime age working group, 24 to 44, with more than 10 years of schooling. That tells you kind of just the preparation of the workforce in a way to tackle jobs that require more skills. And as Rebecca was saying, too many young people actually leave school without the basic knowledge and skills that are needed to succeed in life and work. And there's some data that say that about a quarter of the jobs that we're going to have in 10 years, we don't even see today. So basically what we need is a workforce that's flexible, that's talented, skilled, flexible. And here's in terms again of just learning, because you heard that it's not only about putting children and young people in school, it's actually making sure that they learn at least the basic skills. But here are just numbers that indicate that the enrollment rate at grade 8 the enrollment of grade 8 students as a proportion of 14-year-olds can be quite different from the proportion of the same 14-year-olds who can actually do basic math. So, and this difference between the blue parts of each graph and the green part is actually the failure, I would say, of the education systems to make sure that grade 8 students know how to do very basic arithmetic. And fortunately, we have now many more international tests that give us some of these numbers to show us really the magnitude of the problem, magnitude of the challenges that we face when we think about learning for all. And not just putting children into the classrooms, but actually making sure that they learn basic skills. But research tells us that, so what fixes this problem, right? What do we do to address the learning deficits? Research tells us that actually inputs, spending more money for education will not solve that problem. And that in fact, only 15 to 80% of the variation in learning across children can be explained by more school inputs, more expenditures. And so, what explains learning gaps? Well, one of the things that we know is that we've got to look outside expenditures and inputs and to realize, as I'm sure you all do already, that education systems are actually complex human organizations that involve many people, and that to improve the effectiveness of schools, we've got to think about education reform in terms of changing behaviors of actors, such as students, but also of teachers. So we're going to hear from Fred Nednick about teachers, and the directors of schools, and the inspectors of schools, and the school administrators, those who are in government, and also of school management committees, school councils, which consist of parents and teachers and students. The World Bank's strategy has 3 messages. The CAP is learning for all, and the reason for that, Rebecca, what the change from education for all to learning for all, Rebecca has explained. But under that, we say we need to invest early, invest smartly, invest for all. And so the rest of my presentation is just about these 3 things. And if there's anything I'd like you to remember about what our education strategy is, it is these 3 phrases. Invest early, because much of the learning that takes place in the school has to start out before schooling, before a child even gets to school. I don't know if Matthew is actually going to talk about that, but investments in the nutrition, in the health, in the psychological health of a child happens before schooling, and we need to take care of those. And this is how the World Bank is supporting investments in early childhood, using the greater community participation, because you need parents in order to reach the poorest, because some of the most effective interventions for early childhood is actually about teaching parents about parenting. Supporting a multi-sectoral approach also, because it's not only about education, it's also about early nutritional investments, about immunization, about health care. Building a knowledge portfolio. The other thing is, of course, we're working with several actors who are involved in early childhood development to be able to achieve this. Invest smartly, ensure that learning happens, because we need a new generation. I'm talking to myself and the World Bank here. A new generation of lending needs to focus on learning. And how are we supporting that? We're measuring learning. If we value learning, we've got to measure learning to inform project focus. And for example, in Timor-Leste and Papua New Guinea, early grade reading assessments are shaping how we are going to invest in the education system. We need to use analytical work for dialogue with our own stakeholders. And one of the things we're doing now is actually doing school classroom observations. We're bringing back something that educators know make a difference. Stalin's classroom observations to try to improve teacher inspection systems in these countries. And we have these countries are already signing up for us to help them with this. Financing against results. Again, the money that the World Bank is the largest external funder in countries, but actually our money is small compared to what countries actually put into education systems. So we need to be smarter. Again, I'm talking to us. We need to be smarter about how we use our financing support in order to get results. But we're also doing that even in the countries. For example, in the city of Lagos, there are grants to schools, but the grants, and this is something that the government, we're not implementing this in terms of school by school, but the government themselves have come up with a grant program that gives schools more money, but to be able to get that, they have to say, yes, we're going to improve teacher attendance and we're going to make sure that test scores go up. Investing for the future, we are also, one of the things we're doing to make sure that learning happens is also to recognize that it's not all about cognitive skills. Education is not only about learning math and science, it's also about developing non-cognitive skills. Teamwork, communication skills, decision-making skills for among the youth. And one of the ways we're doing that, again, is to try to give tools to the countries. We're right now in the field in 8 countries to measure non-cognitive skills. Again, there's science behind this with the psychometricians, the psychologists, they know all about how to do this, but we've not used these tools in development. And what we're saying is that if we seriously agree to the fact that schools are not only about the workforce skills that we can measure, that we can test, but they're also non-cognitive skills, we need to find out whether those schools are actually producing those non-cognitive skills that are very important. And here to say that in many of our school systems, even those that are failing, many times we don't need to worry about the privileged and the most gifted, because education systems tend to take care of them. And they can take care of themselves, the richest in the countries, the most privileged. So we need to think about those. In these graphs, they are the ones in red. These are the 25th percentile in these populations. These are their completion rates. And you can see for each of these bars really tells you the difference between the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile. And the longer each line is for a country tells you how much inequality there is. And so we can improve education systems and make it better for all young people in general, but many times the source of disadvantage for those like poverty, like ethno-linguistic, being part of an ethno-linguistic minority, disability, there are sources of disadvantage that cannot be easily addressed by broad education reforms. And so we need to have some of those targeted measures. For example, all right, so on the whole, we're, for example, helping this massive reform in India. India has declared that it's accepting compulsory basic education, and they're trying to find how do we implement compulsory basic education. So we're supporting them, but then also providing targeted support, for example, in Pakistan for girls. In Mexico, for the hardest to reach, so most remote and poorer communities, where we're working not only in basic education, but also post-basic education, such as, for example, in Vietnam, at the tertiary level. So this is just a summary slide to say these are the kinds of support that the tools that we use. This is the amount of lending that we've been giving from 2000, and I call it lending, but it's actually for the poorest countries. The grant element, the grant component is very high. So it's about 60% grant component for what we call lending. The poorest countries don't actually have to pay the interest, and the principal gets paid after a very long time. So in 2012 is kind of sort of darkish because it's not that our fiscal year ends in June, so those numbers are not completely fixed. But you can see that during the financial crisis, our commitments to developing countries both to IBRD, which are the middle income countries, and the lowest income countries, went way up because our financial support was more important to them. But I just wanted to say, the last bit I'm going to say is that I said that it's not only about the money, it's also about the support to improving education systems, because that's the only way we can help countries have sustainable education change. And many times we measure things, for example, access, as Rebecca said, enrollment rates and so forth. We see, the needs for teacher training. We see the needs for better classrooms. We see the need for better technology inside the classroom. But we know that to be able to improve education systems, just as we're looking at this iceberg, we know there's something below the surface. And what is much of that are things that we don't usually see: policies, institutions, implementation capacity, values of the community, values of the society, as well as politics. And we know that there are many things that affect learning outcomes that are outside the education system. And my time is up. And when hopefully during the question and answer period, I can tell you about one big initiative that we have right now, which is about how to help. It's developing an analytical tool and a data platform right now for countries so that they can assess, benchmark, and improve their education system. Thank you.
By the way, I brought some material, so please don't force me to bring this back to Washington. I will just leave this on the table. Together with coffee.
Good morning, everybody. How's everyone doing?
Great.
Fantastic. Thanks for a great presentation. Oh, there you are. That's really set up some of the issues that I would like to talk about in this presentation. I'm going to talk about one specific project that we've been doing in Kenya to evaluate now 3 strategies to improve kids' early reading. I'm going to add a couple of my own statistics to the picture that's just been laid out for you. If you look at the ratio between the achievement of education goals between low-income countries and high-income countries, you see things like access, enrollment, low-income countries are about 80 to 95% of the level of high-income countries. When you come down to primary completion, which used to be our main indicator of learning, and now actual measures of learning, we estimate that, I think this is the most telling statistic of this chart, which is that the median, the average performing child in a low-income country would score at about the 3rd percentile in high-income countries. So in terms of what children are learning, low-income countries are way behind high-income countries, and this is the thing that we're trying to tackle in this project. So here are some of the questions that we came in with. We're looking at simple, cost-effective measures to improve reading. We're interested in what's the most effective way to do this and what's the most cost-effective way to do it. Health interventions have proved to be quite a cheap and simple intervention. There's less clear evidence on the extent to which and the conditions under which they can improve learning in the classroom. There's more evidence on attendance and cognitive skills, such as attention. We're also interested in what's going on in the classroom, which I think has been ignored to a large extent by a lot of experimental evaluations. Pedagogical reform has been, from my reading of it, there's been a lot of attempts to reform pedagogy in the classroom, which have been ambitious and have often been very difficult to implement. So we were interested in the extent to which we can build on what teachers already do well, make incremental changes and see if this can make a difference. And how to sustain these behaviours. And because we're doing these projects on health and literacy, instruction, intervention at the same time, we're interested in the way these two interventions work together. The basic idea is if you do everything well in the classroom, how much can you improve kids' learning? If kids are healthy, they're being taught well, how much can you improve learning? So the situation in Kenya is that about half of students drop out before grade 8. Various estimates that 20% of children reach the desirable mastery level in basic skills. So what is a problem globally is an issue in Kenya. So I'm going to talk about 2 programs that we evaluated of the 3. Briefly talk about malaria. We don't have the results in, so I'm just going to tell you quickly about a project that we evaluated before this current project in Western Kenya. The conventional wisdom is that children are particularly at risk when in infancy and early childhood from malaria, and there has been not much of a focus on the impact on school kids, and this is something we want to investigate. We did this, as I said, in the, do I have the laser pointer here? Yeah. Okay. No, I don't. On the left, Bondo district in the western half of Kenya. We treated kids preventively. All kids got some malaria treatment every term for a year, and we wanted to see the impact it had on their attention in the classroom and on their achievement. So the results here for a couple of attention tests, we found actually these kids were going to school and they didn't feel sick. They were partially immune from malaria, but we had quite a big impact on their ability to attend to the teacher. So there's an impact of about half a standard deviation. That's kind of equivalent to about sort of 7 IQ points on kids' attention. However, we didn't find an impact, a significant impact on their achievement, and this is one of the reasons we wanted to follow up with the current study and look at the impact of malaria on kids' achievement in a larger sample over a longer period of time. So the second study is on the other side of Kenya, in Kwale district on the coast. Malaria is a seasonal epidemic there. So we had a couple of interventions in this project, as I mentioned. And I want to set the scene for the pedagogical intervention by describing or showing you a video of what instruction is typically like in this region.
How do we use this? How do we use the word this? Tumesema this inatumika kwa kikuu ambacho kiko wapi? Karibu na wewe. Sasa tunasema this is a kwa vile nimeshikilia mimi nitasema this is a data. Again. This is a data. Again. This is a data. Somebody to come with a pencil. Okay, let's look Mandela. This is my pencil. Again. This is my pencil.
Okay, so you see, look, I'm sure most of you have a basic grasp of Swahili and can follow along with the lesson. She was teaching the use of the word this, and you know, I say that partly because if you were students in Kenya, you would expect to have a basic grasp of English by the time you're 5, even though you've had no exposure to it. So I'm turning the tables and expecting you to have a basic grasp of Swahili. But the lesson is about the use of the word this, but there's a couple of features that you'll see about it. There's a lot of oral language development, a lot of focus on kids talking, developing vocabulary. And when they read from the board, they do it in a choral way, and it's not clear that everyone can actually read from the board or learns much from doing that. But we actually think, I don't want to give the appearance that we think this is ineffective teaching. There's lots that's great about this teaching. If you look at the international literature, which points strongly to various things that one needs to do well to teach kids to read, one of them is to develop oral language skills early on. A second is to teach the relationship between letters and sounds systematically and explicitly, which means everyone gets the chance to understand it. We think they're doing number one very well and possibly too much, and we want to use what they do when developing oral language and build on it to develop this relationship between letters and sounds. So we developed a whole set of lesson plans and a training intervention, and this is an example of one lesson that teachers were taught. So it's worth mentioning that our project won an award for camera work, which I wanted to acknowledge. You've seen that lesson. It's what's going on is the teacher is manipulating individual letters and gives the whole class an appreciation of the relationship between letters and sounds that could even be implemented in a large classroom. So we had teachers for 5 days. We provided them with their lesson plans and a teacher manual. And throughout the year, we supported them with weekly text messages, which really helped them stay on track and keep motivated. We encouraged them to develop low-cost materials to support the intervention. And we conducted a randomized evaluation of these two interventions. This next year, we're adding on a child-to-child reading component. So this is the results from the first year. We gave teachers about 80 lesson plans to implement, and you see the mean is about 55. Some teachers were very keen and implemented 140 lessons, and there's some struggling teachers at the bottom who didn't go very far with the intervention. Teachers responded very well to our text messages that supported them in the intervention. This is the key finding that we had from we spent a lot of time observing exactly what teachers are doing in the classroom. We found that half of the time they were focusing at the word level, a quarter of the time on the sentence level. We wanted them to be focusing on letters and sounds, and we found that that improved as a result of the intervention. So only 4% on letters and sounds. This is a graph of correlations. This shows the toolbars show a high correlation between what the teacher was doing and what the children were learning. So we find that the biggest predictors of whether kids are learning are on the right here, where the teachers are focusing on the letters and sounds. This improved kids' reading of Swahili letters and their spelling of English. We assessed them on a whole range of early literacy to later literacy skills, and I won't go into technical details of our outcomes. And we analysed the results of our first year of intervention and got them only last week, so I'm excited to present them. The two lines there show you the difference between the intervention and control groups in the second and third term of the first year. That first measure is spelling, which we think is a wonderful measure of kids' literacy. Kids improved particularly on their knowledge of Swahili letter sounds, and that the improvement increased over time. And for reasons that we're trying to understand, we didn't have an impact on children, kids' English letter knowledge. The intervention costs about $8. It's more expensive than your average health project. So this is, we are trying to come up with some, and we have a lot more analysis to do before we can really make strong policy recommendations. But I think our project demonstrates that you can have an effective focus on early literacy instruction that has an impact. And we're not recommending this as a complete model that we want people to take wholesale and scale up, but we think it demonstrates a few key principles about the nature of reform that takes place in the classroom. We have good evidence that there's reasons in the curriculum, there's reasons in the way teachers are trained that they don't focus on letters and sounds, particularly in English. And that our project provides evidence that if they do this, they can have an impact on kids' reading. And I think it gives a demonstration for how, if you build on what teachers already do well, make incremental changes and support them, then effective teacher behavior change in the classroom are possible. And the ministry is excited about the possibility of text message support as it costs a few cents a week, which is many more times cheaper than what the current model is, which is someone driving around on a motorbike to support schools. So we think this has a potential for support. And very important that I thank the World Bank for funding part of this study. In fact, there's been a whole range of great funders that support this study. Thanks very much.
Hello everybody, you can hear me? How are you? Good morning. I am fairly short, so I'll do my best to be brief. This is not mine, this is some other. But this is, I can talk about malaria. All right. Oh, thanks. Okay. See how fast this is going? Okay, so I don't know if you can see this slide, and I hope that I'm not here just for comic relief. There is a great deal of research around and behind what I'm going to say, but I guess everything is actually summed up based upon this, that there is an enormous amount of expertise here. There's an enormous amount of expertise in the world I live in, which is some of the countries that weren't filled in very dark colors on Elizabeth's map. And of course, it says at the bottom here, there's a church and it says, preaching to the choir since 1846. So for me, a great argument is always a kind of a good session. Elizabeth talked a little bit about school, non-school, out of school. When I started the organization, actually, I asked a question from my dissertation that my committee rejected. In fact, people talk about getting into Harvard or being rejected. I was ejected from my high school, and it was a public school. The question that I asked in my dissertation was, what do you see outside your window? When the internet was coming in, and I was saying, I think there should be global social networks of connecting people to information and each other. I didn't know that somebody was messing around with something in the dorm room here. But generally, this kid is desperate to get into school, so the desire to have schooling in its formal sense, and then schooling in the non-formal structures, they're both there. We don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You have to work in existing systems, around existing systems. Greg asked me to talk about the theory of change, which is interesting to do within, 4.3 minutes. But I'm going to give you some, what may appear as simplistic, overarching, and since I'm from Seattle, left coast, woo-woo principles. But around and underneath these are a serious body of research that talks about something that I would believe is really, at least with my organization, making a big difference. The teachers are multipliers. I only have one statistic today. 59 million teachers, largest professionally trained group in the world, right? The ones who know who's sick or missing or orphaned by AIDS. They know who can be conscripted into, military gangs or human trafficking teachers. And that teachers are multipliers, and that we should connect teaching and international development. Okay, that was an interesting revelation for me, and then I fired myself from a very good job as a high school principal to start Teachers Without Borders, which my wife now officially calls an extended manic episode. Now, this particular, so I take these ideas very seriously. That leaders aren't born or made; they just show up. And in my particular program, we talked about all sorts of theories of, leadership. No, I love the subject, and I've read all the airport books, right? But I do think that when you need people, they show up. Okay, it's not magic, but they respond to a particular set of demands. And this one, every single waking second in my life, well, as much as that seems weird, is to focus on this particular issue. That wherever I've gone, and the work that I'm doing, the book that I'm writing, everything I do is based upon this one thing. That brains are evenly distributed around the world. And that if you have a question, somebody has an answer, you don't have the answers, it's not always a panel of experts, and that every organizational thing I do, I mean, I'm the working class academic, here, I was thinking to myself, whoa, I have a resume of a much younger man, is to focus on the expertise and the multiplier effect of people in their own communities to do enormous things. I want to focus from 30,000 feet, keep all that research you've heard in mind, and then go down to 13 miles underneath the earth, where I have a particular, I don't have a passion for 13 miles underneath the earth, but I do have a passion for this particular issue of emergency education, and specifically the connection between earthquake science, safety, and community development. Earthquake science, which is a regionally based kinds of thing. Safety, which is a paramount value. If you want people to go to school, the parents cannot be building phobic. And they have one child in Duzhenyan in China, or they have people in a particular country where there's been earthquake faults and problems. You do not want them, you say, go to school, I'll give you a uniform, we'll give you this, and they're just not going to do it because they need the community to be safe. So I am going to tell some stories. I was in Gujarat, India, after the earthquake, and then spent some time in the Kashmir area doing some development work. Now, interestingly enough, the 10%, I have another statistic, 10% of the real relief work that's been most effective is from international agencies coming in and doing stuff. Communities have taken care of their communities. And when I was in Pakistan, the roads were totally jammed. Why? Because it was individual people in Pakistan loading up supplies and trying to get out to Kashmir and take care of themselves. In the bomb earthquake, there was a woman named Solmaz Mohajir. And Solmaz lived through it, became a geologist, and said to herself, there's no accurate earthquake science and safety out there. But sometimes, in some places, buildings sway, and in other places, buildings sink. And you have to know the difference between whether you go underneath your desk or whether you go outside. And all earthquakes are not alike. The implications for this are enormous, because if you have, remember the frog dissection system, and one plastic layer is the digestive system, and if you take the earthquake zones in the world, they are overlaid on political fault lines as well. And so in Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Iran, you have to be able to, if you're doing work, rely on local people and make sure that the community is engaged. So brains evenly distributed all the time. All of Teachers Without Borders work in China had been focused in Duzhenyan, in Sichuan province. And this is a particular area that turned out to be the epicenter of the earthquake. Now, you have to know that if you're making friends, if brains are evenly distributed, if leaders aren't born or maybe they show up, you have your brothers and sisters there, and you're driving across a bridge in, you know, Seattle, Washington, and you hear there was an earthquake in China, and then you hear that there is a earthquake in Sichuan, and then you hear it's in Zhejiang. So we lost teachers, we lost kids. I thought I was going to lose my mind, and we turned our science program into earthquake science and safety by mobilizing geologists around the world and teachers around the world in their local communities. Now, the issue is, I want to show this very quick thing. In Tajikistan, people believe there's a bowl underneath the earth, and when the bowl is bothered by a mosquito, it shakes, and that's why there's earthquakes. Okay? Now, you can do any education program you want, but you have to deal with that particular issue, right? Solmaz, who is from the region, dealt with that particular issue. This is a 45-second video, I guess. That's the regular thing here. And as that's happening, she's going to talk.
Emergency education here at Teachers Without Borders focuses on preparedness and planning. We taught a workshop in April 2009 and focused on earthquake science, safety, and mitigation. And all of these concepts were introduced through several interactive, hands-on, inquiry-based lesson plans. We know emergency education can save lives. We know very well that even one retrofitted school can save thousands of lives. Teachers do have a voice, and unfortunately their voices are not being heard.
So the voices were certainly not heard in Port-au-Prince. When the earthquake happened, 13 miles underneath the earth, now you have densely populated area, you have poorly constructed buildings, and you have a shallow earthquake. Just perfect, terrible storm. The Haitians instinctively and immediately run indoors for safety, right? Something happens. When we founded the geology teachers, there were far fewer deaths or any kinds of disaster because they knew exactly what was going to happen if there's nothing in the curriculum. So you could work in a policy area to deal with science and safety. I have to work as a fingernails, dirty guy, with teachers relying on their brains evenly distributed. This is after the Chinese earthquake. This is a shrine the parents put up to memorialize their children. But you know what? I think the world's a cesspool sometimes, but it's filled with generous people, leaders who show up. And the Chinese have adopted this program. You asked about the issue of scale. I'm going there, on Monday, but it's a Chinese program now. And in Haiti, it's a Haitian program now. And they're teaching construction and safe buildings. Now in Pakistan, it had to deal with the floods. 40% of the city was underwater. So, the country was underwater. So I just want to say that things can move around the world. This program is in Farsi-speaking countries, working with partners around the world to connect science, safety, and international development. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. We have a few minutes left, and I might grab a couple minutes from the break, 3 minutes, so we can get a full 10 minutes of Q&A. So people have questions? And you guys are, you're going to rove around with this mic that I have in mind?
So way at the back, we'll take a couple. One, all the way at the back. The woman with the blue pen. Yeah.
Hi everybody, my name is Ola. I'm from Brandeis University. My question to the panel, I noticed that if we all know that it's the concentration now on the basic education. Why it's not on the higher education? Maybe this can produce more results as we have a smaller group who can lead and contribute to their community. So I just need to know what the panel think about that.
Okay, we'll take two more. Right here? Right. Nice view from all black hair. Stand up.
Hi, I'm Edith from Bentley University. I just wanted to ask you a slightly more complicated question. In terms of incentives, it's clearly a huge piece of the education puzzle from the top down, whether it's parents or teachers, and each of you have emphasized that. But it's also ineffective, and misaligned goals have kind of made it a problem so far. So what is the best outside of the box thinking that you've seen with regards to aligning incentives and ensuring that children from their parents, the children themselves, and administrators, or even in terms of funding, are able to go into primary education in these low-income countries?
Can you have a microphone or right there? Yes, last question.
Thank you. I'm Yael from the Graduate School of Education here. So I really appreciated when, Elizabeth, you said invest early, invest smartly, and invest for all. Hello?
Sorry. Stand up. No. We have a request that you stand up.
Sorry.
We want to see you.
I'm sorry. And Matthew, you said focus on early literacy instruction as well. So the last report for the OCD said that the expected per capita on children in the last 18 years have been 24% for birth to 5 years old, and 36% from 6 to 11, and 41% from 12 to 17. So I would like to listen to your thoughts on how we should change the policies in order to then invest more in early childhood.
Great. So could we maybe turn off the projector so that the panelists are. So who would like to tackle each one of those questions? You need not get all answers.
So one question was about why are we not paying more attention to higher education and tertiary education? If you saw I guess first of all, we is, I guess, the development community, right? So if you saw the enrollment rates, if you look at enrollment rates, the data, you will find that in fact, if you saw the one graph I showed, which is the proportion of adults 22 to 44 years old, 24 to 44 years old, who have more than 10 years of education, was really very much. In fact, if you look at how many have completed 6 years of education, you will find also very large variations in many countries that have not, where adults have not had even 6 years of education. So when you start with a situation where a majority of the population, and I think your numbers was 55% who have completed primary education. But if you have a large proportion of the population not having completed primary education, it's hard to think about higher education because you don't have the population who would even have had secondary education. But now, with what we're seeing, at least with respect to the countries we help finance, an increasing demand for secondary education and for tertiary education. So now there's a much larger cohort that have the basic education, so they can then push for more choices with respect to secondary education and tertiary education. So I think what I think will happen in the next decade is really a stronger demand for secondary and a stronger demand for higher education. And then you will see the global community pushing more in that direction.
Thanks for your questions. I wanted to tie in a couple of questions that I think have a similar answer. one about the lack of focus on early years, and the other one about incentives. I think one of the reasons, a common perception about teaching is that early grade teaching is for very low skilled people, and it's very low status, and teaching people at Harvard is very high status and very difficult. But I can speak from experience at both ends of that scale that actually getting children to read who come from a non-literate background and in a classroom full of kids who are having difficulty reading is one of the most technically challenging things to do. And mouthing off about your own research to a bunch of smart people in Harvard is pretty easy. So I think there's a real sense in which the value and professionalism of teaching in the early years can be respected to a greater extent. And I think the answer to the incentives is largely in that question. I think a lot of current research undervalues the extent of teachers' own intrinsic motivation to do well in their profession and for their students, and recognizing the technical challenges and the professionalism of teachers, I think is one way to achieve that.
Very briefly on the issue of incentives, that's a fabulous question, and I keep on wondering who the stakeholders or shareholders are, because I'd love to see a kind of way in which incentives are mapped. There's incentives for donors, there's incentives for the teaching community, there's incentives for the union, the policymakers, the families, and sometimes they align and sometimes they conflict with each other. And so your question makes me think about how we can actually look at that particular issue of incentives in light of some pretty significant data about not just what drives behaviors, but what keeps a program going, which is my particular focus. That an incentive is not necessarily to initiate something, but like a good lesson plan, there's a way in, a way through, and a way out, and a way of something lasting over time, so that you can actually measure whether the incentive has been carried out in some form, so that it's not a flash in the pan. I just don't know if, in fact, incentives themselves as a concept, are studied. And that's why I love the question and want to learn more. For my organization, it's been, advancing one's career and connecting, and it's been very intrinsic, but not all the time.
I do, but I want to stand up because I'm also short. So.
The question on ECD, on early childhood education or development as a
whole, and how do we move more money in that direction? That was your question, right? First of all, I think it's not just money. Part of it is that the stakeholders, which is something that Fred has just used, are actually distributed across several ministries of government. So when you talk to the Ministry of Education, they don't really necessarily talk to the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Child Services or something, right? So that's one of the reasons is that you need actually a structure, usually, a coordinating ministry of some sort that will take care of the multi-sectoral needs for early childhood development. That's one thing. Second thing is that many countries still think that preschool belongs to the family, has to be done by the family. It's within the family and not necessarily something that the government should be involved in. So that's one of the other things that get in the way, I think, of ECD. On the question of incentives, in particular, I think with teachers, think about how we're treating, for example, low teacher performance or high teacher absenteeism. We think generally that we need to give incentives on much more explicit incentives. I think what our colleagues here in the panel have said is that it's not only explicit incentives, there are also intrinsic incentives, like feeling of vocation, etc. Right? These are very important things. And the explicit incentives are often just to strengthen the reasons for the self-selection of teachers into the profession. So that's one. But then the other thing is that sometimes we work only on one set of incentives. For example, on let's say, on better attendance by teachers. But then there's nothing else where we measure, what is the, I think that's your point, Kim. We don't measure then down the line, what do students learn? So we have a set of incentives, we work with changing incentives, but then they don't necessarily all connect. We improve teacher training, but let's say we don't then test teachers afterwards or test students afterwards. So we have a system of incentives in the education system, but if they don't connect, they're not going to, each one of those will not be effective. And unfortunately, we tend to think about incentives as pieces, and instead of thinking about them as a whole system, and where you push the button in one part of the education system, you need to think about what it does through the rest of the system.
I think we have time for just one more round. Let's take 3 more questions, and then there'll be plenty of time for everyone to continue the conversation. Great. Let's go in the front here. 1, 2, and the gentleman in the blue shirt in the back.
My name is Christabel from Clark University. From what you were saying, you tested for malaria, like the correlation within school attendance, malaria, for instance. I'm wondering, there are several variables, that could encourage school attendance, especially for the girl child. So what are your thoughts about looking on how to deal with, incorporate like sexuality education, for girls to be able like decision making and all that and negotiate? If that is something you're thinking could enhance the enrollment rate on school attendance.
My name is Graciela, and I used to teach in Kenya, and I was very interested in your study. And one question that I had, one thing about Kenyan education systems is it's extremely test-driven. And I was wondering, when you were talking about how teachers weren't focusing on letters and sounds, and they were focusing on certain things, is how much of that comes from the tests that the governments create that students have to take, and maybe it directly relates to how we're not really testing on what is actually being learned, whether those tests from the governments are testing the right thing. I found with a lot of the tests for the middle and high school level in Kenya, often just were testing a lot of facts and not so much the non-cognitive skills or logic, which are equally important. So how much of the work being done in development could be improved in terms of education by reaching out to the education tests that governments are, that affect what teachers are learning to become better teachers, as well as what's being taught in the classroom, and improving it from that way, or if that's just too difficult?
Last question all the way back. Oh, we got it.
Hi, I'm Dan from the University of Pittsburgh. I was wondering if I could get your thoughts on whether you thought education is a public good and thus should be publicly supplied, publicly funded, or if there's a role for vouchers and giving parents a choice between public or private. And also, Rebecca, if you could also say that'd be great.
Thanks for another round of great questions. Let me address a couple of them. I think teaching girls decision-making life skills is a fantastic idea and needs to happen to a greater extent. One of the biggest barriers I perceive in it is there's just a lot of fuzziness about what needs to be taught, and even if it can be taught, if people know some great research on this, please send me. But at the moment, I feel like there's a real disconnect between what people think would be useful in this area and the good research that says what can be done about training people in life skills, decision making, these kind of things. Yeah, the exams. So what I know about the exam system is, in Kenya, the way I see it works is that children sort of saunter through their education to about grade 6, and then at grade 6 and grade 7 they start to panic because they think they're going to fail the primary school leaving exam. I think the problems with early grade teaching are not really related to the incentive structure in place by the exams, except perhaps that you draw the best teachers to the top of the primary school system. It's more to do with traditions of teaching and curriculum, the way the curriculum is structured. I think if anything, I would argue for more tests, at least more assessment of, at least informally, to inform pedagogy in the first few years. And I think the big problem has been that no one really had any data on how kids are doing until sort of grade 6, at least, when they do the SACMAC exams or grade 8. So I think there's now a focus on assessing kids early on, and I think that can make a big difference.
The experience of connecting malaria. Oh, louder?
We cannot hear back here.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Sorry. We missed a lot of this.
Oh, sorry. He was brilliant. The connection between, I would advocate for far fewer tests and more of these kinds of assessments, which are snapshots in time, aggregated over time, and have a little, I get a little uptight about the testing phenomenon, but I know where it's going. My experience with malaria is to look at the outcome rather than necessarily, even as a teacher here, the direct instruction. You know, we must teach this, we must teach this, we must teach this. The direct outcome is a health outcome, right? So one of the programs that I saw that should be measured and assessed regularly was that teachers gathered together, even in communities that had malaria mosquito nets. They gathered together to put a game and a competition together to turn the malaria nets into pup tents, because people were stringing the net outside sort of to ward off or protect the indoors, but they weren't covered by the net. So when the kids were making pup tents, they were gathering underneath, and their parents would allow them to sleep underneath this tent. And then the measurements that were coming through were, you know, classic randomized trial. I mean, they were looking at the number of pup tent mosquito nets as opposed to just pure distribution. So, I mean, I want to just be very granular, look at the particular issue, its outcomes, and find the assessment that might match on a regular basis something that you can use tomorrow.
One question was, is there a role for the private sector? Right? That was your question. You probably think that since I'm at the World Bank, I should be answering that question. I'm interested in that question, but I want to say that we need to differentiate between financing, provision, and management. And that the public-private dichotomy is a false one. It is false, right? It does not reflect reality. In fact, you can have schools that are private, low cost, privately managed, but 80% financed by the government. I've seen those schools. And then you have schools that are actually public, they are state, they're owned by the government, they're managed by the government, and heavily financed by the private sector, in particular communities. So the public-private dichotomy is a false one. If there's one message I can give you, it is that. And so, and is there a role for the private sector? Yes, these are your stakeholders. They are the ones who are actually going to hold schools accountable. The private sector include parents, they include the employers who are going to use the skills that schools produce. They are the ones who are going to be producing the materials that are used in schools. There is a role for the private sector.
All right, you guys, we have to wrap it up. We are well into the break. Please feel free to give everybody a round of applause.
Thank everyone. As Rebecca said, we're a little bit over, so if you guys can filter out as quickly as possible, and if you have any questions about where the next panel is that you're interested in, just ask.